friends, it's Jen, and this is the second video in my video series about my unplugged quilt pattern. This video is going to be all about cutting up your fabric, and I'm going to walk you through everything you need to know and probably a lot of stuff you don't need to know. Hopefully you're going to find this helpful. You don't need to watch the videos to make this quilt, but you do need to go get the pattern from my website, jengeorgeburt.com. Everything you need to know is in the pattern itself, but the videos are just a fun little extra, and I hope you'll enjoy them. So, before we start actually cutting and thinking about cutting, you need to have picked out your fabrics, and you're going to have two different options for how you're going to cut your backgrounds and two different options for how you're going to cut your plugs and your cords. All right, so it depends on how many colors of fabric or types of fabric that you've picked. So if you have decided that you want to have a bunch of different background colors like I have here, then you're going to be cutting your backgrounds one background at a time, and there's cutting instructions for that. If instead you want an all white background quilt, for example, you'd be cutting all of your backgrounds at the same time, and there's a separate set of instructions for that. And that just makes better use of your fabric depending on how you're cutting. Same thing happens with the plugs. In this quilt behind me, I used the same fabric for all the plugs and the cords. So I would have used the instructions for cutting all the plugs and cords at the same time. But there's also instructions for cutting one cord at a time, one cord and plug at a time, if that's the way you want to go. So depending on how you want to, how your version of the quilt is going to look, there's cutting instructions for all the different ways you might need to cut. So decide what fabrics you're going to use, and then that will dictate which background method you use and which plug cutting method that you use. Right? So one last thing before we actually dig into cutting is when I give you the amount of fabric that you need in the pattern, I always figure out exactly how much you're going to need, and then I round up to the next quarter yard. I do that because, one, some quilt shops only sell you fabric in quarter yard increments, and the other reason is because I personally like to have a little bit extra, so I know if something terrible happens, I have a little bit to work with, and a little extra fabric never hurt anyone, right? All right, so let's get into cutting the fabric. We're going to start out looking at a digital diagram on my desktop. So let's switch to that view. Okay, so what you see here is a digital diagram that I created when I was deciding how to tell you to cut up 1 yard of fabric to cut one background at a time. This is the width of fabric here across the top, or WOF. And what that means is you have selvage here and here. And so this whole width, including the selvage, is going to be somewhere between 44 and 45 inches for most kinds of quilting cotton. But the inside part here is going to be, I have assumed, 42 inches. So it's at least 42, but it's an assumption so you don't run out of fabric. Right? Okay, so the first thing that you need to do, the first instruction tells us that we need to cut a rectangle that is 32 inches by the width of fabric. In other words, we're going to make a cut right along here. And this part down here ends up being extra fabric or scrap. Then we're going to cut these long strips of A, and then we're going to cut the long strips of B. At that point, you will then have this chunk of fabric left over. And in the pattern, I refer to that as the remainder of the 32-inch strip. So from that strip, you're then going to cut this way to get a 17-inch chunk. And it's going to be around 20 inches, depending on what your width of fabric was to start with. And then from that, we're going to cross cut here to get this 13.5 by 17-inch chunk, and this turns into scrap. And then finally we cut a 7.5-inch strip, and from that we cut all these little rectangles. And then when we get to this last one, it's a little different. You're going to cut this 3-inch strip, and then you're going to turn it sideways and cut some smaller rectangles from that. Same idea with this 2-inch strip. You cut that and then you turn it sideways and get the 2 little H's. This turns into scrap, that is scrap, that is scrap, that is scrap. So that's all there is to it. That is my thinking on how I did all 4 of the cutting lists that you'll find in the pattern. And it's just a little bit more cutting or a little bit less cutting, depending on what it is you have to cut. But the idea is exactly the same. So let's go and move to my cutting mat so you can see me actually do this, but with real fabric. Okay, so here I have 1 yard of fabric. So these are the selvage edges, and between the selvage edges, from here to here, that's your width of fabric. So that's the one that's going to measure somewhere around 44 to 45 inches. And then 42 inches or so in between will be usable fabric. Along this edge, along a selvage edge, it's going to be 36 inches, which is 1 yard. Okay, so the very first cut tells us that we need to cut a rectangle that is 32 inches by the width of fabric. In other words, this is our width of fabric across here, selvage to selvage. We need to measure 32 inches down and make a cut somewhere along here all the way across. Now that cut's too big for my cutting mat. So what I need to do is fold my fabric in half like this. And I already did this before we started recording. And I took it over to my ironing board and I got a nice crisp fold right along here to work with. So first thing we need to do is put that crisp fold along a line. I'm going to line it up with the dots down here because this fabric is particularly wide. So I'm lined up. And then I had already pre-trimmed this, but I can see I've gotten a little off whack. Okay, so there we go. That's lined up. If this was not a straight edge, which it probably won't be if you just folded it, you would need to take your ruler and trim that off right there so it's even with 0. All right, so there's my edge. I've lined it up with the 1/2 inch dots on my mat. Now, if you are left-handed, you'll probably be working from the other side, but I know you lefties know how to do this, so it's exactly the same thing, just using your other hand and from the other direction. So, but the instructions would be exactly the same for you lefties, like my husband. All right, so the first thing, I got to cut 32 inches. So I'm going to double check again. Yes, that's straight. That's straight. And I'm on 32. So I'm going to go ahead and make that cut. Okay, this bit over here, this is the extra, and that can just go in your scrap bin, which I'm going to do that. Okay, now in the pattern, I have a big blue bubble that says, hey, hold on, don't go crazy. Make sure you pause right here because the next instruction tells you want to start making some strips that are 6 inches wide, and it will be very, very tempting to just start slicing and dicing this way. I know this because I did it. So I want to help you avoid doing the same thing. So the next cuts are supposed to be 32 inches long by 6 inches wide. If I started cutting this way, I would get strips that are width of fabric, and those are way too long. Instead, I need to cut along here because those are the ones that are 32 inches. All right, so in practical terms, this really means that I just need to take this fabric back to the ironing board and fold it the other direction. Okay, because that way, if I cut this way, I'll be getting 32-inch strips. Right? So I'm going to go to my ironing board and do that, and I'll be right back. All right, I am back, and I have folded it in half the other way. In other words, I have selvage on both ends, whereas before I had all the selvages up at the top. Now let's double check this and think about what's happening. So if I look at this, I can see, okay, that's 16 inches. So I know 16 times 2, that's 32. So if I make a cut right here, this strip is going to be 32 inches long. So always, there's a lot of switching back and forth for different directions you need to cut. So if you always just check, hey, is this going to be the right width and length if I cut this? Then you won't ever make a mistake, or you'll catch yourself before you make the mistake. All right, the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to line up this nice crisp fold that I made along a line. And I don't want to include the selvage edge in my quilt, so I'm going to cut that off. So I don't want to go crazy and cut too much off and lose a bunch of fabric, but I've hung all the selvage edge off as far as I need to, so that when I cut here along the 0 line, that selvage edge will come right off and give us a nice clean line to work with. All right, the next thing we need to cut is a strip that is 6 inches wide. So I go out to the 6 line, and 32 inches, which we know that's correct. So I'm going to check again. Is that straight? Yes. Is that straight? Now, I'm always going to check to make sure this is straight before I cut, because if you've ever cut long strips while it's folded in half, you know, if you don't cut exactly perpendicular, you end up with a weird V shape, and your strip is not exactly straight. So always check that. All right, 6 inches. That one's good. And then we need 6 more. So I'm going to go over here to the 12. And then I've got 1 more, 6 more, which is 18. And I'm going to double check. Yes, that's still mostly straight. Let's straighten it up a tiny bit. And then make sure, yes, we didn't do anything bad that's going to make a mess. All right, line it up and go. Now, these are all A pieces. If you're reading the pattern, you know that that's what those are called. So I suggest piling those up, putting a little piece of paper that says A or something like that on them, or maybe you have something fancier than that, but then putting those away somewhere where you can, so you don't get them mixed up, all right? Because I refer to those pieces by letter later on in the pattern. So keep them straight now and you'll save yourself time. You won't have to re-measure things later. All right, the next thing we have to cut is 2 rectangles that are 2 inches wide by 32 inches long. So we know that's still 32, just like it's been before. And check for straightness. Not really straight there. Let's make sure we're nice and straight. Looks like I moved it a bit when I made that last cut. All right. 2 inches. Good. And then 2 more inches. All right. And then those are my B pieces. So I'm going to label those and put those aside. Now, at this point, you have to do something a little different, because this is what we're left with. And the next cut tells us that from the remaining part of this strip, the first thing we have to do is cut a strip that's 17 inches wide by around 20 inches. All right, so let's think about that. If I kept cutting right here and I cut something that was, 17, this is going to be 32. Or if I cut 20, that's not going to work. All right, so let's look. This is, my side here is 23. All right. Now in the pattern, it says it's going to be about 20. Of course, that depends on what your width of fabric was to start with, right? So this fabric just happened to be longer, but this is my around 20. So I need to cut 17 inches across here, and that'll give me 17 to around 20. So let's use the line here at the top, because that was a nice straight edge that we had cut. And then make sure this is all lined up along the 0. And that looks nice. I'm happy with that. All right, so let's go over here to 17. All right. In real life, I probably would have gone and pressed this this fold out and made it flat, but for the sake of television, we're just going to go ahead and cut it, okay? All right, so here's 17. I'm on 17. Let's double check. I'm straight. I'm straight. All right, I'm happy. All right, 17. Now, really, I have to cross cut something here, but so I don't have to move too much stuff around, I'm going to go ahead and cut the next strip that we need, which is 7.5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And yes, that's really how I do it. I'm a math person, but I never trust myself to actually do math when I'm cutting because it's failed me too many times. I get stuck in the moment and I do weird things. All right, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's correct. I've double checked myself. That's nice and straight. We know that's straight because we cut it. And 7.5. Okay, super. So this part here, that's scrap. That goes in the scrap pile. And we'll deal with the 7.5 inch in a minute. All right, this is the one that was 17, right? Double check it. Yep, that's 17. All right, so from this, we are supposed to cut a chunk that's 17 inches by 13.5. So I'm going to line up this line across the bottom. I'm going to make sure I'm lined up here. That looks good. So I go to 13.5. Make sure I'm all lined up. And good. 13.5. All right, and this is your C piece, so label that and put that aside with the rest of the things. This is scrap and goes in the scrap bin. Now let's come back to that 7.5 inch strip. This one has a lot of cuts that we need to do. All right, so we're going to line it up. I'm going to line it up at the bottom. It's easier to see, I think, for me. All right, and all the pieces we need to cut out of this need to be 7.5 inches wide. So we're going to cut across this way. All right, the first one needs to be 3.5 inches wide. So line that up with 3.5. Scooch that a bit. Check for general straightness. All right, we're good. Happy with that. 3.5. All right, good. Label and set aside. The next two are supposed to be 3 inches. So 1, 2, 3. And here we are. So line that up. Double check. 1, 2, 3. Yep. And then 1, 2, 3. And we have that one. All right. Those two label and set aside. Then the next ones, there's 2 of them that are 2 inches. All right. So 1, 2. That looks good. All right, 2 inches. And then 1, 2. There's 2 inches. Good with that. And then, of course, label them and put them aside. Now, this next one is where the funny thing comes in. We're going to cut one that's 3 inches wide. So 1, 2, 3. Let's do that first before we talk about what we're going to do with it. All right, we cut it. And then we want to cross cut that. We need 2 smaller little rectangles that we're going to cut out of this. So I'm just going to line this up so I know where my things are. And the little rectangles are supposed to be 3.5 by 3. So that's our 3. So we need to go across to 3.5. All right, there's 3.5. Good. And then we go 3.5 more to get the second rectangle that's that exact same size. And then this tiny little bit that's left over, that's scrap or trash. That one might be small enough that you don't need to save it, but I'll leave that up to you. Then we're going to label those, set them aside. Then we're going to do a 2 inch strip. All right, so 1, 2. And we're going to do the same sort of thing with this one that we did. And this time we need little rectangles that are 3 inches by 2 inches. Line that up. There's our 2. So we go across to 3. And cut. And then 3 more. and label those and set them aside. The rest of this is scrap and goes into your scrap bin. So that's it. If you always pay attention, measure 14 times, cut once like I do, then you're not going to run into a problem where you're cutting the wrong direction. So just keep checking, and there's nothing more complicated than that.
All right, here we are back at the digital drawing of what we just cut. So let's just go over it one more time really quick, just to lock in what we just learned. So the first thing that we did was we cut along here to get our 32" by width of fabric rectangle. Then we cut these long strips of A and B. Then we were left with this big rectangle out here. And from that, we cut a strip that was 17 inches wide. And then we cut a strip that was 7.5 inches wide. Then we went back and cut this 13.5 by 17" piece. Then we cut all of these little rectangles. And then finally we cut this 3-inch rectangle, which we then subcut to get smaller rectangles. And then we cut this 2-inch piece and subcut that. And that's all there is to it. I use the exact same sort of methodology and thinking in all of the different cutting lists that you're going to run into that you might need. So most of the time you cut a long strip from the width of fabric and then you chop it up in some way. Now on some things, such as lots of backgrounds at the same time, so all your backgrounds from the same fabric, there's just a lot more cutting involved, but the whole process is very similar. Same things with the plugs, cutting them one at a time or all from the same fabric. Let's take a look. Okay, so far we've talked about how to cut one background at a time. This digital diagram is for cutting all your backgrounds from the same fabric at the same time. So it looks like a lot because it is a lot. You're cutting, 6 times the amount of pieces that you cut when you were cutting one at a time. So it looks like a lot, but it's no more complicated. It's just more cutting. So this across the top is your width of fabric. And then all along here, that's 4 3/4 yards. All right, so you're going to start out just like you did before. You're going to cut a 32" by width of fabric strip. And then you're just going to cut that up into a bunch of A pieces. The next one, you do exactly the same thing. Cut another 32" chunk and then slice and dice that into some A's. This one is similar. You cut 32" strip. You cut your last 4 A's that you need, and then you start cutting some B's. You get the most of the B's that you need will fit into that strip. Then you move down here. You cut a 17 by width of fabric strip, and you cut 3 C's from that. All right. And then this one, exactly the same thing. You got 17 inches. Cut these. Now you'll notice this part down here, that looks really similar to what we did for one background at a time, right? You're going to cut 32" chunk, and then that's going to be scrap. And you're going to start out cutting these last 3 B's that you needed. All right, they didn't fit up here, so you got to cut them down here. So you cut those, and then just like we did with one background at a time, you take what's left of the strip, which is this chunk over here, and then we start cutting in the other direction. So we're going to cut this strip that's 7.5 inches wide, and then cut some D's. And then notice there's 2 little E's here at the end. I had to add them up here because I tried to put them in this row, but it was too wide and I was worried you were going to run out of fabric. So I just stuck them up there. So you're going to get all of your D's and then 2 E's. This one, you cut 7.5 inch strip, cut all the rest of your E's that you need. This one, you cut 7.5, you cut all your F's, right? And then G strip, that's 3.5, and then we cut most of the G's that we need. You'll notice there's 2 more little G's that didn't fit in up here, so I had to put them in this last row, which is a little bit odd because you're going to cut this at 3.5 to start with. Cut your G's, And then you're going to take what's left, which is the strip here, and just kind of turn it sideways and skinny it down, right? It was 3.5 inches wide. We need it now to be 3 inches wide. So you make it 3 inches wide, and then you start cutting your H chunks from there. So as you can see, it's exactly the same thing, just a little more cutting than you had to do with one background at a time, which you would expect. Okay, let's move on to how you would cut a single plug or cord. All right, so one plug with its cord at one time from a fabric. So this is only a 1/2 yard of fabric, and you'll notice here you're going to have a good bit of this 1/2 yard left over, but this is as close as I could get it to being a good use of your fabric because of these long strips, which cannot be turned this way. I know that would make life easier, but it just didn't work out that way. Okay, so you're going to start out just like you've done with all the other ones, and you're going to cut a width of fabric strip. This one 16 inches by width of fabric, and then this part's extra, that's scrap. And just like before, you cut some long skinny strips, and then after you do that, you'll be left with this chunk of fabric. And then you're going to do just like you did before. You're going to cut a strip from that, which is in this case 7.5 inches wide, and then you're going to cut a couple of J's and the K, and then that goes in your scrap bin. And then you're going to cut a strip that is 3 inches wide, and then you're going to cut an L and an M, and then that's scrap. And then finally you're going to cut 3.5 inches, and then you're going to cut this in. All right, so this ends up being scrap, this ends up being scrap. So that's it. This one's super simple. You don't even have a thing where you have to, cut a thing and then cut sub rectangles from it. This is the easiest of the 4 cutting diagrams that exist in this pattern. Okay, and here we are with our very last digital diagram that we're going to look at. This one is what you would need to cut if you're going to cut all your plugs and cords from the same fabric. So just like in all the other diagrams, this side here is the width of fabric, and in this case it's a 1.5 yard cut of fabric on this side. All right, so just like you might expect, you're going to cut a 16 inch by width of fabric strip, and then you're going to cut all the eyes that you need, right, all the way across. Then you're going to come down here and cut a 3-inch strip, and from that you're going to cut, pay attention now, 2 M's and 2 L's. And the reason I did it this way is because otherwise I was going to get them all to fit well and to make good use of the fabric. If I did a bunch of M's here, I could only get 4 M's, and then I end up with 2 hanging over. So for the sake of consistency, I'm having you cut 2 M's and 2 L's, right? Then the exact same thing for this, 2 M's, 2 L's, and then one more time. 2 M's, 2 L's. Easy enough, right? Okay, so same sort of idea happens here. This one is 7.5, and then we cut these 2 chunks, and then we cut a bunch of little J's. All right, then exact same thing, 2 K's and a bunch of J's. Then the final one, that's where it's a little bit different than the other rows. You start out the same, you cut your 2 K's. And then from this remaining strip, you're going to turn that sideways and cut 3.5, and then cut that up into 3 ends. And then you're going to cut another 3.5 inch strip, and then you're going to cut 3 more ends. And that's it. As you can see, all the same. I keep saying it to you, but I want to reiterate. If you watched the me cutting the fabric for one background at a time, You can do the exact same thing that I did there, follow all the tips and tricks that I showed in that one, and you can cut any of the other 3 cutting lists without problems. So that's why I'm not actually going to take you to my cutting mat and force you to watch me cutting up all of that fabric. I feel totally confident that you can handle this, and just follow the instructions. Always check your width and your length and that you're all lined up straight before you cut, and you're going to be fine. I promise.